Hi, Dan Stein here, President of FAIR. The situation on the southern border is getting pretty bad. It's pretty outrageous, actually. Look, after almost 40 years working on this issue, I can tell you've never seen anything quite so irresponsible, quite so remarkably irresponsible. And at some level, you don't get mad, you get pissed off. What's really frustrating about the whole situation is Jan Psaki. And the president himself rarely comes out and does interviews. When he does, he denies facts, denies reality. Look, I'm pro-reality. I'm big time into reality. And I want to talk a little bit about Jan Psaki because she's the primary person we hear from the White House and about some of the techniques and tactics that she's using to obfuscate, to dance around the issues, mislead. Now, these reporters who were in the White House press corps, they were bulldogs during the Trump administration. They were relentless. And many of you may remember that President Trump made a big deal about the fact that he brought the southern border under control. Love him or hate him, President Trump did something very important. He demonstrated that if you enforce the law the way Congress intended, you can actually control our borders. And they were under control. I mean, Joe Biden, the minute he starts talking about his big mass amnesty bill, April 2020, May 2020, the numbers start going up and then they exploded the minute he became president. There's no denying this. There's no denying the fact that President Biden took a full-on sledgehammer to all the major initiatives that the Trump administration did without, by the way, the help of Congress to actually bring this under control. The Northern Triangle country agreements, cooperation from Mexico, requiring people to ask for asylum in the first safe country they went through, no forum shopping, no to say, oh, I just want to live in the U.S., I'm going to use the asylum system, tightened up asylum standards, reinvigorated interior enforcement, cooperation between state and local police and others, tried to get criminal aliens removed. When Joe Biden's coming in, this is a guy with, 40-some years of public policy experience. I know, everybody knows he doesn't have any executive experience. He's never run anything. And, he's vice president. He obviously didn't do anything. So, he's never actually run a business. He clearly doesn't know how to execute anything. And he doesn't, the level at which he's engaged is unclear anyway. And the level to which he even understands. Jimmy Carter made this mistake in May of 1980. May of 1980, Jimmy Carter said, "We will welcome with open arms and open hearts anybody who wants to leave Cuba." What happened? Mariel boat lift, flood into Miami, changed the city forever. Communities still trying to cope with parts of it, aspects of that boat lift all these years later. Joe Biden did something far worse than Jimmy Carter did. And somebody who's been in office as long as Biden has been and makes these kinds of mistakes hasn't learned from experience. He deserves nothing but utter contempt from the American people at this juncture. But let's focus for a minute on Jan Psaki. Now, for some time now, it's been very clear that for the advocates trying to get a mass amnesty bill, they know that if they focus on the kids, they got a better shot at getting what they want. There's great PR advantages on focusing on the kids, the magic phrase, through no fault of their own, they came, blah, blah, blah. Unaccompanied minors showing up at the border. Well, lo and behold, you can trace it back to the late 1990s in the Clinton administration. A settlement was reached cooperatively with the ACLU to limit the detention of alien minors to 72 hours. Then you had to release them. All right, that started the whole process. Now, despite efforts by the federal government to renegotiate that settlement, to change the terms, courts have been unwilling to change that settlement, the so-called Flores settlement. But compounding that, in 2008, Dianne Feinstein, Joe Biden, and some other Democrats in Congress got the brilliant idea that they could stop trafficking of minors by coming up with a special procedure to treat alien minors when they show up differently than everybody else. Well, the thing was supposed to prevent trafficking, but actually all it did was create a loophole that trafficking organizations are now exploiting, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. Now, George W. Bush signed that law, it's true, but it was primarily the instigation of Dianne Feinstein, Joe Biden, and others in the Senate back in 2008. So 2007. So let's take a look at the downstream effects of that. Biden comes into office and he says, we're just going to do what the law says. Well, the law doesn't say that you have to set up a system by which an unlimited number of people can be smuggled into the border, show up artificially separated from a guardian or a trafficking organization, and then use the Wilberforce anti-trafficking law to engage in what is essentially government-sponsored smuggling to place the minor children with relatives in this country, many of whom are here illegally. But that's what's happening. Now, Jan Psaki doesn't want to explain to you what exactly is going on. I mean, what they're really setting up is a whole system for the wholesale extraction of young people and bringing them into the country outside the rubric of our general immigration law and immigration selection criteria. Now, we got 15 million illegal aliens in the United States. Obviously, something's not working. Something isn't working. Anybody can see that the government hasn't done its job. It's failed to do its job at every level. Well, how can this be that somebody would turn around and say, well, we're going to admit people temporarily for asylum, let them work in this country or go to school or whatever, but they're not going to be able to stay. This is a fraud. This is a lie. This is disingenuous at this juncture to tell the American people these kinds of lies. And what are these sheep, these people masquerading as reporters doing, asking these questions? I know it's early in the administration, the honeymoon phase, but come on. What is Jan Psaki saying? Let's analyze some of her comments, and I'll explain to you what she's not telling you and why it's so important.
The Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who said the following. He said, "We are not saying don't come to those migrants." He said, "We are saying don't come now because we'll be able to deliver a safe and orderly process to them as quickly as possible." So the message was, don't come now. It sounds like the message is, come later. So when should these migrants come?
Well, as you know, the president has put forward an immigration reform package that will not only provide a pathway to citizenship, but will help put in place smart security measures at the border, will also address root causes in the region. There also is time, and he talked about this quite a bit yesterday, as you know, that we need to dig out from the immoral and ineffective approach to immigration of the last administration.
Okay, what does any of this have to do with what the reporter asked? Which is, you're saying don't come now, come later. The implication is you will be able to come later. Her response is to attack the Trump administration because it actually got the job done. Then she talks about a bill which operates retroactively, okay, idiotically, of course, but the Biden proposal says if you're here January 1, 2021, okay, here's how ridiculous this is. You get a green card eventually. It's going to take a while, but you get a green card. What does that have to do with the question? The question is, for people who have not yet come, you're telling them they ought to come later. The root causes issue isn't going to affect whether they come later. I mean, unless you believe you have a magic wand and you're going to make these Northern Triangle countries some kind of utopia in 6 months. So you're not even addressing at all the question. You're just taking it as an opportunity to explain why it's immoral. Or not explain, but just call as immoral, requiring aliens outside the United States to respect our laws. That's what was immoral about expecting people in other countries to respect our system, respect our process, respect our nation of laws.
That's going to take time, probably months, for us to be able to process people at the border, to get people on the right path for consideration of for asylum seekers and others.
All right, so what does that mean? They're going to process people at the borders. It's going to take months to get on the track of processing them quickly at the border. So when people come in, they won't have to wait. Is that the idea? Is the idea that they come in such large numbers that there won't be a process of detention at all, that they'll just count them as they race across the border? And therefore there won't be a delay and there won't be any congestion at the border where there won't be any temporary detention? What is she saying? I mean, she's saying gibberish.
Now is not the moment for that.
What's not the moment? Now is not the moment for what?
It sounds like, even if unintentionally, you're sending the message that these migrants can come, they just got to wait a little bit longer. Is that the message you're sending?
Okay, the reporter comes back and says, you're not answering my question. What are you saying? Can you tell me what you're saying? And she has, of course, this little cat that ate the canary smile, like she thinks she's too cool for school, like we're not supposed to figure out that she's full of it.
Well, we've been also clear, as he was yesterday, the majority of people who come to the border are turned away. Even undocumented, even kids who come in at the border, unaccompanied minors who come in, and we have emphasized time and time again, we want to keep them safe, we want to treat them with humanity. They are not guaranteed to stay in the United States. They still go through the processing.
All right, now she just pulled a switch. Title 42 is still in place from the Trump administration, that is COVID related. Okay, we do have a pandemic going on and all this nonsense is taking place. We have a pandemic. And so there's a law that's still in place, Title 42, has to do with the health emergency that allows the summary denial of immigration benefits during a pandemic. Now, the left is putting pressure on Biden to roll that up. But for now, she's resorting to that and saying we're still turning people away under that provision. But then she, sleight of hand, says, but we want to treat the minor children differently and protect them, and somehow that is supposed to be related to keeping people out of the country. But they're not keeping them out of the country. They're inviting them in. They're incentivizing them to come in. At no point will she actually say what we're doing, which is we're actually bringing in, with cartels, cooperatively with traffickers, people who are engaging in child trafficking, sex trafficking, in drug crimes and other things, bringing these young people into the country and then trying to match them with sponsors where they will remain in the United States indefinitely. And we're going to set up a procedure in the home countries to extract them and fly them in at the dead of night so that affected communities will not be consulted at all. At least when you have it happening at the border, the American people can see what's going on. What they're really trying to do is set up a process so that nobody can see what's going on and eliminate any transparency.
We just don't want to send them back, and the consideration of whether they can stay here through what is possible through our laws. It is still a difficult time. It's a difficult journey. We are not encouraging people to come, but we also believe differently from the past administration that we are not going to turn away kids who are under 18.
You're obviously encouraging people to come if you're not turning them away. If the traffickers and relatives know that they're not going to be turned away if they're under a certain age, they're going to come. And they're going to come without limit. And they're going to come from all over the world. There are hundreds of millions of people who want to come into this country. Congress, in its wisdom back in 1965, made it clear they did not want alien minors. They did not want minors who were born under the 14th Amendment to be able to petition their parents as a result of having been born to an illegal alien mother. And the reason they did that is they didn't want the abuse of our immigration laws, birthright citizenship, to be a grappling hook in order to get the rest of the family in. And this is an important principle. Now, the whole country's flipped it on its head. Ever since the DREAM Act in 2002, the Democrats have decided to try to narrow in on the minor population. They're sympathetic, they're good PR, DREAM Act and all that kind of stuff. People, through, quote, no fault of their own, brought them in. They figure this is a good target population to wedge people into the country in order to eventually bring their entire families in, bring their relatives in all along through chain migration. Despite decades of trying to eliminate chain migration, it persists in this country. It makes it an unworkable immigration system, completely unresponsive to the desire of the American people to regulate the size of the flow annually. It just grows and grows and grows. I mean, to the point now where you still have people saying we have a labor shortage in this country with 17 million Americans out of work and the whole country in an economic recession, a severe recession. They're bringing in all this foreign labor now to do work and compete with American workers and jobs. And this woman acts like there's no impact on schools, on low-skilled, low-wage jobs, or anything else. The huge amount of money required to provide education for people who are illiterate in any language or who may be suffering from shock and trauma. This is not a good strategy for the future of our country, to put it mildly. And she's not being honest at any level with what's going on. She's not leveling with the American people. This kind of deceit and dishonesty is exactly why people elected Donald Trump in 2016. We're right back to business as usual. I mean, when people see the results of a policy that doesn't work, unless they have an ulterior motive, you have to ask yourself, what is the agenda?
Is the president going to be briefed on this from the Domestic Policy Council today? DHS assessing 117 or so thousand unaccompanied children. 117,000 unaccompanied children will arrive in the U.S. by their projection this year. Will he learn about it today? And that number seems like a crisis. The secretary said it isn't. How would we define a crisis?
Well, I'll leave that to the Secretary of Homeland Security to define. He said it was a challenge. It is a challenge. We have more than 7,000 unaccompanied kids who have come into the United States, and that is certainly a lot.
All right, our borders are completely out of control. We're overwhelmed, completely overwhelmed at any level. There's a dysfunctionality taking place now in immigration enforcement. President has suspended all interior enforcement. He's rolled up state and local agreements. He's had a complete moratorium on removals, affecting just about everybody, including criminal aliens. And this is not a crisis. If you take away all the incentives for people to respect the immigration laws, I mean, what would constitute a crisis? How many million people have to show up at our border, run across it before it's a crisis, making immediate demands on our taxpayers, public services, and benefits? What kind of studied air of unreality are we dealing with here? Why won't they call it what it is? And why won't they accept responsibility for something they created willfully and intentionally?
And that is certainly a lot of children that we are trying to treat humanely and safely and process through the system as quickly as we can. That's not easy. That is a challenge.
You can treat them humanely and safely by returning them back to their home countries and back to their relatives in the home country.
The administration needs 20,000 beds to shelter these children. Based on our own reporting, 97% of the beds through the Office of Refugee Resettlement are full. So I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but at what point does it become a crisis?
Well, I would say I don't think we need to meet your bar of what we need to call it. We had the Secretary of Homeland Security yesterday conveying it's a challenge. We've provided numbers publicly about how serious that challenge is. We, of course, because we are approaching this humanely.
It's a crisis. It's not humane. It's impacting our American kids. It's impacting our own communities in this country. There's nothing humane about what they're doing. What they're doing is essentially allowing a group of people in one country to try to send their kids into this country while their parents come illegally or already have come illegally, and they want to reunify them in this country at taxpayer expense. Impact of the people who are least able to handle the impact. Lower wage workers, less skilled American workers, the people who've been most dramatically impacted by this pandemic are the ones who are going to be most directly impacted by this policy. This is deceit, and it's dishonest, and it's offensive at every level.
Early on, you and Secretary Mayorkas very much stressed humanity and trying to move away from the last administration. Does the message need to be tweaked at all? Do you need to say that it's not just about humanity, that also you might not get in, or you probably aren't going to be able to stay?
This idea about humanity versus non-humanity. The Trump administration tightened up immigration, and what happened? Wage rates increased. Record levels of employment for Hispanic and African Americans. We saw major increases in wage rates, finally, for less skilled American workers. We actually started to make some progress in this area. What is this idea that somehow enforcing immigration laws is not humane? And why is it humane to selectively allow some people to exploit loopholes in the immigration system over other people who may, frankly, have greater need or even be in more dire emergent circumstances than people in the Northern Triangle countries? Yes, there is some violence in some of these major cities, but there's violence in our major cities. There are people around the world who are close to starvation. Why do you decide that this is the humane way? What is the point? But these reporters are asking some very basic, simple questions, which is, don't you have to say no at some point?
Well, humanity will always be a value from the president on down. But you are right that we are continuing to work to convey to people in the region that this is not the time to come, that the majority of people who come to the border will be turned away, which is factually accurate. And what we're really talking about in terms of the people who are being let in are unaccompanied children. That is a policy decision which we made because we felt it was the most humane approach to addressing what are very difficult circumstances in the region. And that means there are more children, kids under the age of 18, of course, coming across the border.
So she's saying our policy means more are coming across the border. We're saying some people are being turned away at the border. We're telling them now is not the time to come in. Now, unless you're telling them they're going to be allowed in at some point in the future, why would they listen to you? Why wouldn't they just try to enter without inspection? Why wouldn't they run around the Border Patrol, go find some place where they've left a wall unbuilt and come in that way? Why would they wait? Why would they go home? What kind of idiocy is this? And what is the policy? The policy of limited numbers of people under the age of 18 who are obviously going to be in this country for years as a result of this. And at some level, people will want to say, well, what about their parents, right? I mean, what the disingenuousness of this is phenomenal.
Ensure that we are keeping these kids safe and moving them as quickly as possible from Border Patrol facilities to shelters where they can have access to educational resources, health resources, mental health resources, legal aid, etc.
Mental health resources, educational resources, legal aid. Our kids don't have these things. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Why on earth would you want to set up all these incentives for people to come illegally? Do you hear what she's saying? All these resources, this is March the 9th. 2 weeks ago. She's saying we're giving all these benefits. How much is this costing taxpayers? They won't let people in. They won't let reporters in. There's no way to monitor these conditions. There's no way to actually track what happens to these kids after they're released into the society, put on buses or whatever. I mean, we saw this in the Obama administration, but they're doubling down now as if this is some kind of a game, as if there are no costs.
But there are a couple of reasons why we think people are coming to the border. Of course, individuals are fleeing prosecution, fleeing violence, fleeing economic hardships and other things. The region has also experienced 2 hurricanes in the fall, and all of this is taking place during a global pandemic that has impacted other countries' economies, placing undue hardships on its people, just as it did in the United States.
No. All this is happening because Joe Biden promised they could come. All this is happening because this administration rolled up the very agreements that prevented it in the first place. All this is happening is because Joe Biden undid with a sledgehammer, prematurely and without any real thought, the things that were working, without any plan for how to deal with it. That's why. Now, there have been hurricanes going on down there for a long time. Earthquakes, political instability, crime, organized crime, gang violence. Sure, it goes on all the time. That's not why this is happening. This is a lie.
Why won't you confirm that number? That's a very important number.
We've been very clear that there is an increase, that there are more children coming across the border than we have facilities for at this point in time. Those numbers are tracked by the Department of Homeland Security, so I'm just suggesting that you talk to them about specifics.
Well, we talked to them, Jen. They won't confirm the numbers.
Well, I would encourage you to go back to them and ask them again. We're not going to confirm them from the White House. It's not our program.
So it's not their program. It's the Department of Homeland Security program. But they can't give you numbers, and we don't have the numbers. And apparently the White House doesn't superintend a program that the Department of Homeland Security is running. I mean, they just nominated this guy, Mayorkas. They confirmed him. FAIR, of course, opposed his nomination for very good reason. He believes he has this right to ignore immigration law and bring people in by hook or crook through various techniques. He established that with DACA in 2012. After Obama said he didn't have the legal authority, Mayorkas was part of that cabal that came up with that strategy. Now it's up to 1.5 million people. Legality is still in question. It just goes on and on and on. And this is simply more disingenuousness.
Is the White House encouraging the department to release those numbers then in the spirit of transparency that the Secretary promised here at this podium?
We certainly encourage transparency, but what I also think is important is to talk about what the root causes are here. And
we've been talking about the root causes of the problems since the 1980s, since the civil wars began. Of course, the left always said it's the United States' fault, that we screwed these countries up. Obviously, that's not true. Obviously, sovereignty entails responsibility. They talk about getting rid of the root causes. How on earth is this administration, with a country that has almost a $30 trillion public national debt, where are they going to come up with all this money to fix these problems in Central America? And what's the plan? I mean, they haven't even passed an infrastructure bill in this country in a long time, decades. So what do you mean root causes? I mean, and frankly, if you put the money down there, it's likely to be used. It's going to be used by people to make the trip to pay smugglers to get into the country. I mean, this just can't be. This just can't be that we're listening to this gibberish at this stage of our national history. I mean, to be watching what's going on, this is a fiasco. This is a train wreck of ineffective leadership.
And last week, you weren't ready to confirm that new facilities might be brought online, including perhaps
Fort Lee in Virginia or Homestead, Florida. Can you give us any new details about how many new facilities might be repurposed and how quickly?
Well, now we know they are going to add more facilities, convention centers, military facilities. Look, the point is, if the numbers are unlimited, potentially unlimited, you have to keep adding more and more and more facilities. And the only way you can avoid that is if you expedite the process of moving through the existing facilities, which means you won't be testing them for COVID, you won't be doing any background checks, you won't be doing proper screening, and you won't necessarily know who it is you are reuniting them with. So either you're going to expand the facilities indefinitely, or you're going to completely compromise national security and public safety.
Can you tell us anything about any diplomatic efforts that are taking place between the Biden administration and these Central American countries to find ways to deter some of these children from coming to the border?
It's a great question, and it's a key part of our strategy. I've actually asked Roberta Jacobson if she could come join us in the briefing room, so we hope to do that sooner.
But in the meantime, no information about any conversations that are taking place between the U.S. and the
Sure.
government?
All I was conveying is a commitment to get you an expert that is involved in these discussions who can help answer your questions. But one of the key proposals in the president's immigration bill is additional funding to address the root causes, and that's something we're certainly communicating about.
Wouldn't it have made sense to keep in place the programs that were working before you tried to figure out what the root causes were and how to fix them? The intractable problem of fixing root causes could take decades. In the long run, we're all dead. I mean, who knows? They certainly aren't going to fix it in 4 years. Why would you roll up programs that were working? The migration protection protocols remain in Mexico, and these Northern Triangle agreements and the asylum reforms that were so effective in finally cleaning up this mess of fraud. Why would you do that until you actually address the root causes? You fix the problem, then you lift the controls if you feel you actually got the reciprocity of respect that justifies making these changes. This is ass backwards, and anybody can see it. Besides, Congress isn't going to pass that law anyway.
That's higher than the peak of the 2019 border crisis when it was around 2,600 then. And at that period, there were kids sleeping on floors, they were overcrowded facilities. So when his delegation traveled there, did they see that? People sleeping on floors and overcrowded facilities?
Well, first, one of the reasons is because we have a different policy than the last administration. We're not turning kids away at the border, unaccompanied children. We're also, of course, not ripping them from the arms of their parents. And so we know, and we know there is going to be an increased number of kids coming across the border.
So you're not ripping the children away from the arms of their parents, but they're unaccompanied minors, who obviously are, in most cases, intentionally being separated at some level from somebody they're related to in order to make them unaccompanied, in order to take advantage of the loophole you've created. This is a height of hypocrisy. What does this mean? This woman contradicts herself 10 times within any single sentence.
They are going to do a meeting, of course, and give the president a full rundown of what they saw on the ground, a trip that he asked them to take, and I'll let them do that before we have more specifics.
Well, the administration is not allowing cameras into the facilities. They're keeping reporters away. And this is transparency.
Then when can cameras actually get inside those facilities?
We're committed to doing that. I don't have a timeline for you at this point in time. We want to do it with respect for the privacy of the people staying there, people who are being housed there, but also abiding by COVID protocols. And so we're working through some of those steps.
Okay.
You see, you have to understand what the real agenda here is: to be able to quickly move people into sponsor houses. And they want to do this by flying people into the country and doing so without any public notoriety about what's happening at all. They don't want people to know. This is transparency. Total secret extraction migration, as Neil Monroe likes to call it.
Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, says the people coming into the U.S. right now see President Biden, as the migrant president. Does the White House take that as a compliment?
Migrant, give me a little more context.
So many feel they're going to reach the United States. We need to work together to regulate the flow because this business can't be tackled from one day to the next.
Well, first, it's Mexico is an important partner in ensuring we're addressing the flow of migrants from Central America through Mexico, many to the border of the United States. We have conveyed privately and publicly as well that the majority of people who come to our border will be turned away. The way to humanely approach immigration is to allow for, for unaccompanied minors to come and be treated with humanity and be in safe.
First of all, if you are telling people that you are never going to remove them, and that once you get into the country, there's virtually no immigration enforcement, that you had ICE stand down and effectively not play any role, why would you expect people to accept being turned away by the Border Patrol at a port of entry? They'll just enter without inspection somewhere along the way. They'll be driven across in one of these vans by smugglers. Do you really believe that you can effectively control immigration if you don't enforce the laws at any level in the interior?
Not asking about Governor Abbott, asking about President Biden in charge of the federal government. Why are the feds relying on NGOs to administer these tests? We've talked to people down at the border who say that migrants are only tested if they show symptoms. That seems like a loophole.
That's not an accurate depiction. There's an important role that NGOs, that local mayors, that local officials play in working together. And this is a proposal that was worked with DHS, with FEMA, and others to help address and ensure that people are tested. And Governor Abbott, I raised that simply because he had raised a concern about that, and I wanted to be clear that we've put forward a proposal. So I think the question is, why is he standing in the way of local communities getting the funding and support they need to help with testing, isolation, and quarantining efforts?
Well, the big question is, why are we admitting them in the first place? Why do we need, in the middle of a pandemic, why would you admit anybody under these conditions? Why would taxpayers have to reimburse NGOs? And why would NGOs be reliably testing, and what legal authority do they have to enforce a quarantine? None of this makes any sense. And now she's, of course, as always, turning it into a partisan Republican bashing, Abbott, Trump, whatever, session instead of dealing with the facts. Why are they doing what they're doing? Other than saying they want to act humanely. Well, it's not humane to bring in people and release them when they have COVID. And apparently that's part of what they've been doing.
They're spending on average over 100 hours, 4 days in these facilities that are jail-like facilities not meant for children. So how can you say that's not a crisis?
Well, I think what Ambassador Jacobson and Secretary Mayorkas were conveying, and what I've conveyed, is it doesn't matter what you call it. It is an enormous challenge. Relaunching, as we talked about over the last couple of days, the Central American Minors Program, accelerating the unification of children with vetted families, family and sponsors.
Accelerating reunification with vetted families and sponsors. So is this what you're running, a family reunification program? Or a refugee program, or an asylum program, or a humanitarian parole program, or some weird combination of all of the above? People here illegally don't have the right to petition relatives to come and live with them in this country. Nor do people legally, for that matter, if they can't get a visa. And why are you picking Central American countries to extract young people and bring them here, but not from other countries? And where does this end? Obviously against the backdrop of Biden's irresponsible mass amnesty proposal. In the end, immigration laws won't matter at all, and our borders will be totally out of control. Or as former Senator Alan Simpson from Wyoming, who for many years chaired the Senate Immigration Subcommittee, helped push through some decent immigration laws, he said, look, if you lose control of the case-by-case process, you don't have a country. And that's where we're headed. If this kind of stuff continues, this has to be stopped.
These Border Patrol facilities are not made for children, that we are focused on expediting the time they spend there, that these HHS shelters are not meant for permanent living, for anyone permanently living there, that we want to expedite the timeline between when kids cross the border and when they are getting to sponsor homes.
All right, what she said there was very critical. They want to expedite the time the kids come in to get them to sponsored homes. What they're trying to do is set up a system where the children are brought right in immediately. So the issue isn't so much that they're being detained and put in these facilities for any length of time. The issue here is how many of them are coming in and who's going to pay for them when they get here. And when are they ever going to be removed when they don't qualify to remain here? None of those questions Jan Psaki is addressing. And in the end, you can see it's about moving people into the country as fast as possible. They're upset about the congestive effects of having to delay the process of finding sponsors. And they're concerned, obviously, because of the pandemic. But the end game is to rapidly accelerate the process of bringing people into the country by any means necessary, even if you're cooperating with smugglers and others, and doing so in a way that's outside the rubric of our overall immigration law.
We stand by our decision and our policy as an administration not to send unaccompanied minors back on the treacherous journey.
But this whole thing doesn't add up, doesn't make any sense. Are you admitting people through these facilities who you believe have relatives in this country that they can be matched with? Or who are these other sponsors you're talking about joining them to? And are these people with no attachments at all whatsoever? A 3-year-old shows up, nobody knows who this is. You put them with a sponsoring family, a sponsoring agency, and then they stay here indefinitely. And why that particular person and not some other particular person, other than the fact they were brought here by a trafficking operation? What's the criteria, other than just saying we're not going to return minors? How do you ever control the downstream increases that are clearly coming? I mean, this is when if you're going to be faced with 300,000 people marching to the border, what are you going to do? And this disingenuous idea, she keeps coming up about the vast majority are turned away. No, they're not. You're not returning anybody once they get into the interior of the country. You have undermined virtually all of our immigration laws and destroyed the operation of our immigration control system, made a mockery of it.
That is our policy because we feel it's humane and it's moral, and we think the world sees it that way as well.
A policy can't be justified based on the empty rhetoric that it's humane and moral. Okay, FAIR is humane and moral. You are humane and moral. Most Americans are basically humane and moral. But you can't sit down and say, we're going to spend your great-grandchildren's money that they're going to earn in advance to take care of the health care of people who are in their 70s now and call that humane or moral. That's a lack of foresight, and that's not humane, and it's not moral. It's just a matter of assigning priorities and where you want to put your resources. So are we going to have to sit and listen to this rhetoric? They tell us on one hand they don't believe in labels. On the other hand, they whip out these empty labels to justify a policy, and they won't even tell you what the policy is, what it represents, or what the ramifications of it will be over time.
Does there need to be a more streamlined message in order to prevent this surge?
Well, she also talked about, Kristen, which is true, in the region we're working against the efforts of smugglers and others who are conveying a different message. One of the steps we're taking that I touched on a little bit earlier is also thinking of rebuilding or going back to some of the policies that were in place previously where children could apply for the Central American Minors Program, and they could apply from the region, which would mean they wouldn't make the treacherous journey.
So where in the law is the legal authority to run the Central American Minors Program, and where's the legal authority to determine eligibility for that program? And is she saying that you have to qualify because you have a relative in this country? Well, what about all the people showing up at the border who don't have relatives in this country? What are you going to do with them? Again, what is she saying? They're just going to run an arbitrary program outside of public view with no transparency, where they're flying in Central American minors without apparent limit? And where does this go? This was an untenable program under Obama. Why would you want to revive it now? I mean, you're simply saying, well, we have to bring them in this way because otherwise they'll come illegally. Now, that's not a country that's controlling its borders.
We're also looking for ways to expedite when kids are connected to family members, to safe sponsor homes, and we're looking for ways to expedite getting them from the Border Patrol facilities into the shelters as well.
So again, it's an effort to try to run people through the system as fast as possible. Jan Psaki needs to explain under what conditions somebody who is denied the right to stay is going to be removed. Under what conditions are they going to be required to return home? And based on what we've seen already for the last 30 years, there's every reason to believe they're never going to be required to return home. So why would the American people continue to support this gross manipulation of immigration law? Why would Congress want to be considering voting for amnesty bills now in this environment when you obviously have a messaging problem going all over the world?
And ultimately, when they get to the point where we're there with sponsor homes, many of them will not be able to stay. Most of them. They have to apply and they have to go through the process. But
okay, once again, Jan Psaki is talking out of both sides of her mouth. What do you mean they won't be able to stay? How many people brought in under the Central American Minor Program in 2017, 2014, 17? How many of them have been returned home? Well, you got 15 million illegal aliens in the United States. Most of them have come over the last 25 years or so. Many of them have found ways of getting legal status, married U.S. citizens. Others have died. Maybe some have returned home. Relatively few people actually get removed. So this idea about them not being allowed to stay, then how are you going to return them and who are you going to return them to? I mean, what are you saying and why are you saying this? Why are you standing up there lying?
About the Central American Minors Program.
sure.
I just want to make sure that I understand you correctly, that you were presenting that as sort of like an immediate solution to what's happening at the border. So that process in itself takes months, no?
The process was stopped, as you noted, in 2017, and the kids who were eligible then will be prioritized.
So it's not an immediate solution to what's happening in the border.
I don't think I said that. I don't have a timeline for you, but it is what I actually, if you were listening earlier, I gave a number of steps, actually. That's one of the steps. The other steps and address some of the things that you just raised, including the fact that we are working to find ways to accelerate the unification of children with vetted families.
Okay, so what does one have to do with the other? The Central American Minors Program prioritizes people who are in line illegally, of course. In 2017, the Obama administration had left there, and the Trump administration abolished the program. But she's saying we're also going to be expediting other people coming through the border. So what does one have to do with the other? I mean, she's essentially saying non-solutions to a huge problem that's going to undermine any aspect of the Biden presidency. Look, I want to tell you something right now. There is nothing more devastating politically to a politician, to a president, than the appearance of out-of-control borders. Visual appearance of boats, of buses, of people clamoring across borders. It is a devastating political negative. No politician who has any interest in running again would ever do. Now, maybe Biden doesn't plan to run again. Probably doesn't. But this is a devastating attack on his administration. He looks weak. The administration looks inept. They look incapable. And very clearly, they have no real plan other than trying to accommodate a continued growing chaos on the border. No matter how hard they try, they're not going to be able to fly in enough people to stop this.
This isn't a challenge that's going to be addressed through one step, but certainly the Central American Minors Program is a way. And the reason I talked about it is because it's a way to help ensure that the application process for these kids happens not while they're sitting in shelters in the United States or even with sponsor families, but when they are still in their home countries, and they will know before they make the journey that they are able to come and stay in this country. And that's a pretty pivotal step to take.
Do you really believe they're going to be listening to the State Department over what the smuggling operations are telling them is happening? In fact, if you get in and you get a work document, you get to stay for a few years, you get to be with a sponsored family, why wouldn't you do it even if you had your application denied in Central America? This is not based on the reality of how human nature is, how people operate. This is fraudulent. These are not competent people in charge of our country at this point. It's very clear.
If you want to send the message to migrants that the border is closed, shouldn't President Biden be the one who is clearly delivering that message?
Well, he did do an interview with Univision about 2 weeks ago, and he is one of the voices. Ambassador Jacobson is one of the voices. There are a number of effective voices in the region, including leaders in the region, including partners we need to have in the region, NGOs and others, to deliver the same message that now is not the time to come.
The problem is the president. The problem is not I don't want to say anything about Roberta Robertson Jacobson. I mean, forget about her. But the people down there are listening to Biden. They have Biden T-shirts. Biden let us in. They all think Biden is a savior. Biden has to be the one to deliver the message. The Mexican president is saying Biden is causing the problem. How can you send a bunch of undercompetent functionaries to go down there and sort of deliver a message? Nobody knows who Roberta Jacobson is. I mean, come on, man. I thought this was the no malarkey special. This is malarkey. This is ludicrous. The president has to lead and not do backyard interviews with George Stephanopoulos. Really lead with very clear voice that this is not going to be tolerated. The only way to stop it is to change the policy.
Based on what you have said before and our understanding of the policy, it's just guidance that these migrants who test positive, many of them are instructed you should go and quarantine and isolate. Does the administration know how many actually do versus how many actually just go off to wherever?
Well, I just wanted to convey, because I know you were asking a good question here, that the very specific processes that are taken for each scenario. And certainly there are, with the individuals who are coming across, alternatives who are treated with, again, noted sometimes ankle bracelets as they come across while they're waiting for adjudication of their cases. There's a proposal for testing all of these individuals as they come across.
So here Psaki is dancing around this whole question of who's getting tested and under what conditions. And they're delegating some to NGOs. They call them alternatives to detention, families who are being released by the Border Patrol pending their hearings. The testing sounds very erratic. Clearly, local communities are not prepared to handle this kind of responsibility, and they've made that abundantly clear as mayor after mayor has pleaded with this administration to stop doing what it's doing. Once again, we see, under the guise of cooperation, a tone-deaf administration just doing whatever it feels like it can do.
Does the president believe that his administration has a handle on what's happening on the southern border right now?
The last administration left us a dismantled and unworkable system, and like any other problem, we are going to do everything we can to solve it.
Okay, here we go again. This last administration dismantled the system. No, what the last administration did was set up a system that ensured compliance with our laws and deterrence, stopped massive fraud of asylum, the gaming of the system, closed the loopholes. What this administration is doing is setting up loopholes that are being manipulated by smugglers and trafficking organizations at the expense of children, putting them in harm's way. This administration is setting up intentionally procedures that are being manipulated and costing taxpayers millions of dollars at a time when we can't afford it in the middle of a pandemic. It's inexcusable to sit there and try to blame the Trump administration. This administration, the Biden administration, had no responsibilities to undertake. They undertook these responsibilities willingly by dismantling the programs that were working. Maybe they thought they were immoral, but they never explained exactly why. An asylum process that allows unlimited numbers of people from all over the world to come in, petition, get a hearing, get released, get a work document, disappear into our society is not a workable system. It's not workable. It's not required under international law. It makes a mockery of our borders, and it needs to stop.
FEMA, this was an announcement over the weekend, is now providing support at the border, adding extra capacity to HHS for quick processing to avoid overcrowding. We hope this will help quickly get children into HHS and ORR facilities and placed with vetted sponsors and families.
Okay, so now we've included FEMA in the mix. Now they say it's not a crisis. They promise us it's not a crisis, and yet the Federal Emergency Management System is involved. Agency. Emergency. Sounds like a crisis. Must be an emergency. The problem is, when she lays it out, it's not an emergency, it's a process. They're simply trying to expand it on an emergency basis in order to institutionalize it on a larger scale process. For an ongoing process without limit and without end. This is important to understand. All she talks about is accelerating a process that nobody wants to see happen. And nobody's interested. She doesn't care about the impact on schools or communities or healthcare or housing or wage rates or anything else. These are people coming in. They're going to live somewhere. They're going to burden social services and systems. They obviously. are going to have an impact. Joe Biden, when he was campaigning, said he thought we could take 2 million more people in the country a year, no problem. How does he reach that conclusion? Where does he get this idea? We haven't updated our transportation infrastructure or anything else to accommodate these additional people. So where does he get this idea? And why would he want to undo so much progress that was made in the last 4 years to finally improve Hispanic and African American unemployment rates, wage rates, and bring people back into the workforce? The number of people within the prime working age population who are not in the labor force is at record high levels. Why wouldn't you want to turn that around with better immigration controls? None of this makes any sense. And it's certainly not a proper response to the very people who delivered the White House to the Biden administration.
We rescinded the 2018 MOU between DHS and HHS, which we believe will encourage families and sponsors to come forward without fear of additional immigration enforcement. And we've seen this as an issue where family members or even sponsor families are worried that this will mean they will be tracked. And
so there you have it. One more example of them undoing something the Trump administration did. In this case, allowing people here illegally, illegal aliens in the United States, to come and claim relatives without fear of being removed. Okay, again, in total contravention of immigration law, why would you want to set up a system to reunite relatives in this country here illegally at taxpayer expense? Why would we want to support this system? Why do you believe you have the right to completely thumb your nose at an entire area of federal immigration law? I mean, this is exactly the kind of overt sabotage of the immigration law system that we've seen now repeatedly from the Biden administration. How do they expect people to actually respect our laws? Why would you not come in illegally under these conditions? You know, what kind of immoral nonsense is it to reward people here illegally, not only by giving them all our public benefits, but by giving them the right to come forward and claim their children? And then say, don't worry, we're not going to remove you. You have no right to be in the country. Why do you want to promote this? And to whose interests are you responding at this point? I mean, this is why the American people have become so cynical and alienated from their government. These are people who seem to have no interest in what the average American is interested in. And it's no wonder so many Americans are suffering. After 40 years, 50 years of completely irresponsible immigration programs, with the stagnation we see in the labor force, the lowering of our competitive national capability, the overwhelming impact on our public schools, Anybody can see that young people aren't learning. Now they're so busy with the congestive effects of dealing with newcomers with their language problems and other issues. School-age population has swelled dramatically in ways no one anticipated, in part because of immigration, mostly illegal, but even legal, far beyond our capacity. So now employers try to rely on foreign workers educated in a different country to actually do STEM work, technical work. This is a disaster. This is an unfolding disaster before our very eyes.
You know, there are a lot of Americans who see him going to take these trips this week to promote this popular law and think, but why can't he take time to go down to the border?
Well, I would say, Ed, that his focus is on developing solutions, pushing his team, encouraging his team to develop solutions that will expedite processing at the border, that will open more facilities, that will ensure kids are treated with humanity and also treated safely.
Again, we don't know what the end game is. All we hear is expedite, expedite, expedite. Speed, 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 speed. That seems to be the imperative. What a catastrophe. And obviously the president is too infirm and incapable to actually do what needs to be done. I mean, 4 years we had a robust president who, despite his age, showed up everywhere. This guy throws a log on the fire and apparently talks to people in meetings when he gets out of bed, whenever that is. This is total non-engagement in a serious crisis and a complete abdication of responsibility. He won't even take responsibility for a crisis he created. I mean, where is this going? Where's this leading? Where are we going here with this? This is really frightening stuff. You should be very afraid by what you're hearing coming out of this person's mouth. Jan Psaki, if she's the best they got, this doublespeak, this non-responsive answer, this circular responding, this deferring to other agencies to get statistics, circling back. I mean, these reporters are giving her a terrible pass because she's not being candid about exactly what the plan is at all.
On immigration, does FEMA's arrival at the border mean that the administration feels what is happening down at the border is a disaster?
I know that we always get into the fun of labels around here, but I would say our focus is on solutions, and this is one of the steps that the president felt would help not become a final solution, but help expedite.
With FEMA, though, specifically, their mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters. We've heard you say that it's a problem, that it's a challenge. Is it now a disaster?
Well, it's pretty obvious the administration's created a disaster. They've created it of their own volition. They did it intentionally. They did it with their eyes open. The fact that they won't admit their own responsibility, culpability for sending the messages out that created the disaster, for establishing the very policies that have created it and incentivized the traffic, and now are establishing a process of speeding up the phenomenon without regard to its cost and impact on our society at large, without end, into the indefinite future. This is a disaster of the highest order in the middle of a pandemic. Nothing can excuse this abdication of leadership, this irresponsible train wreck. This is appalling. This is the most insane behavior that I've ever seen out of any administration. This is the most ideologically driven nonsense. It's as if they believe that their moral authority allows them to destroy the chances for so many young Americans who will be competing, who will be not getting the education that they deserve because of these folks coming across the border now. Do they honestly believe this country really has, which lives on borrowed money at this point, printed money, monopoly money, has the ability to absorb so many people over such a short period of time? And if they were to pass the amnesty they're proposing, they would add an additional 15, 20, 30 million immigrants over the next 20 years after that, on top of the 10 to 15 million who would get amnesty. I mean, it never ends. This seems to never end. TPS for Burma, TPS for Venezuela. They want all the people with TPS to get green cards now. I mean, they must dislike this country so much that apparently the only thing the Biden administration can do besides print money is to give away our land and our resources and our physical space. Because I guess he can't get anything else done on climate change or whatever. So this is what he's going to do. He's simply going to use the country as a doormat and use our public facilities as a doormat at a time when we ought to be investing in infrastructure and the technical training for our young people. This is what they're doing. Our problems are not Salvador's problems or Guatemala's problems. Yes, they're in our hemisphere, but sovereignty entails responsibility. These countries need to take care of their own people and find ways of political reform and economic reform to attract their own investment capital. This is not a solution to the hemispheric problems. The Biden administration has this entirely backwards, and we're all paying the price.
Does that mean that the federal government now is moving beyond the message from the last couple of weeks, which was now is not the time to come?
No, we are doing both, and it's a complicated problem, no doubt about it. We are sending the message clearly in the region. Now is not the time to come, but also we want to ensure that people are treated with humanity.
Now is not the time to come, but now is the time to come. This is very effective messaging. You should try using this with your children sometime. See how it goes.
Children being hungry, sleeping on the floor, not being allowed outside for days at a time. Why is that acceptable to go on even for one more day? Why is that something that's not being outlawed right now? How is the administration not stopping that today?
Well, Yamisha, it's not acceptable. But I think the challenge here is that there are not that many options. So the options are, and we have a lot of critics, but many of them are not putting forward a lot of solutions. The options here are send the kids back on the journey, send them to unvetted homes, or work to expedite moving them into shelters where they can get health treatment by medical doctors, by educational resources, legal counseling, mental health counseling. That's exactly what we're focused on doing. And this is an across the administration effort that we are committed from the top to making changes on as quickly as possible.
So wouldn't it be great if all our children in this country, poor children, many of whom been here many generations, had access to medical doctors, an educational system, and their mental health therapy, and all the other nice things she's talking about? Wouldn't it be nice if they treated American citizens as well as they seem to want to treat these children when they come across the border? Obviously, it would be nice if they would articulate what exactly the end game is. Are we going to have an institutional process by which unaccompanied minors, orchestrated through trafficking organizations, come pouring across our borders indefinitely into the future, forever? And to what end? What kind of a system are they trying to build? Has the Biden administration thought this thing through at all? It sounds like they have absolutely no idea what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the end game is. Anybody who believes that the people they're settling in this country with sponsored families are going to be sent back home anytime in the near future has not looked at the Biden administration's interior enforcement strategy. There's no enforcement of visa overstays, no enforcement of departures after an order of removal. They're effectively destroying the immigration control system. So how can you admit people, anybody, under conditions where they're likely to not leave when they're supposed to? So for her to say, well, they're probably not going to be permitted to stay. The reason the Trump administration prevented them from coming in the first place is because once they're in the country, it's impossible to get them out. How many times do the American people have to be lied to? How stupid do they think the public is at this point, having seen this pattern over and over again? Surely the public deserves better than this. The process under Trump was working. It was a process that made people stay outside the United States and ensure that the American government retained control of the process. The taxpayers weren't built for the cost of a dysfunctional system and having to chase down people if you ever even thought about doing it after they were ordered removed. It was a process that tried to ensure that the level of illegal immigration would stop, that it would slow down and it would stop. And the prior administration did so many important things, all of which have been undermined by the Biden administration. They've created this crisis. This is a Biden border crisis. He owns it. He's politically responsible for it. Everything that flows from those decisions can be seen in front of your very eyes. It's the first time any American president has taken office with the intention of affirmatively sabotaging effective and working immigration controls for the purposes of mollifying a political base, undermining public support for the administration, and clearly creating a disaster politically for the administration. We could have told you this was going to happen. There are solutions. They were in place. They should be restarted. The Biden administration is going to have to wake up to reality. We cannot be the home of last resort for all the world's displeased and dispossessed. We've got to have some sensibility put back in the process. Alejandro Mayorkas is clearly not competent. He's not capable of running Department of Homeland Security. He basically believes that he has this right to bend the law, to bring in people under various statuses, parole and other things, deferred enforcement departure, deferred prosecution, prosecutorial discretion on a class basis, which is clearly not legal. And he created the DACA program, and now he's trying to create this mess. And this guy's a mess. I mean, he's making a mess of our immigration system. Why would Congress confirm this guy to run DHS? Look at the results. And, you keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. That's a definition of insanity. What you hear from Jan Psaki is borderline insanity. It doesn't make any sense. It's not honest. It's disingenuous, and it's fraudulent. I don't know how I can be any more clear than that. How long can the American people put up with this nonsense? I'm Dan Stein. Thanks for listening.